All right, so good afternoon, everyone. It is 3:05 p.m., so we will go ahead and get started. Councilman John Bullock, Chair of the Finance and Performance Committee. Pleasure to be joined today by Council President Nick Mosby. Also members of the committee, Councilmember Danielle McCray of the 2nd District, and also we are joined with Councilmember Odette Ramos as well, and then also member of the committee, Councilmember Felicia Porter. Today, we're also joined by other representatives of the Council President's Office, the Mayor's Office, and our staff to the committee is Marguerite Curran. So today, we're meeting to discuss legislative oversight 230051 agency briefing, tax increment financing, TIFs, payment in lieu of taxes, pilots, and in the tax credit working group for the purpose of calling on pertinent city agency representatives, including Baltimore Development Corporation, Planning, Department of Finance, Budget and Treasury Management, Department of Housing and Community Development, and the City Administrator's Office to come before the committee to brief the City Council about the status, effectiveness, and performance of prior and existing tax increment financings, payments in lieu of taxes, and to provide an update on the Mayor's Tax Credit Working Group. This should include financial data showing the surplus, deficit, and/or cost of the city, data showing the economic impact to the city, and future predicted obligations. This is a very timely issue in Baltimore, and from our perspective, it's really important to do this in a very public setting so that we can be as transparent as possible and also provide the most relevant data. Looking at the cost and the benefits of the city. And so we're hoping that as we go through the presentations, and I'll turn it over to finance after the council president, are we achieving the stated goals of these projects? Is it moving the needle for our city, but also what is the fiscal impact? And hopefully that will come out today. One other piece that's come up quite frequently in our conversations in the city council is the term equity. And so how these programs are being applied in an equitable fashion, whether we're talking about race and gender, or if we're talking about geography, and looking at the parts of our city that sometimes seem untouched. So again, this is a very, very important conversation, and I do want to provide an opportunity for the council president to weigh in before we get started.
Mr. Chair, I concur with your opening statement wholeheartedly, and I say let's get into the presentation.
All right, awesome. So I will now turn it over to Department of Finance.
Okay, thank you. My name is Bob Senemy, Deputy Finance Director, here to present today. Also want to mention we have a few folks from Finance, so Michael Moiseyev, Janelle Rogers, and Joanna Collado, also from Finance, and Colin Tarbert from BDC today. So I'll, the request from the council was to show the status of, TIFs, pilots, tax credits, and to provide some commentary on how we think they're doing and their effectiveness. So we'll go through it one by one. We'll start with, TIFs. So on next slide, first, just a little bit of background on how TIFs work and what the framework is that we use for managing these projects. So as you can see here, the legal framework, there is authority in the city charter. It's Article 2, Section 62, which gives us the authority to actually issue TIF debt. The issuance of those bonds and the setup of any development districts or special taxing districts also has to go through the council. So I know folks on the council have probably seen some of these in their tenure here. The city charter also requires that the proceeds of any TIF bonds only be used for certain purposes. So that's one thing I wanted to clear up right away that I do see sometimes misunderstood when I see this topic come up. The proceeds can only be used for essentially public infrastructure costs, things like parks, utilities, streets, and such. It can be used for acquisition costs, which would fall under that category, but the proceeds generally are not allowed to be used for, vertical development, so to speak. It's really for the public infrastructure. Outside of the legal authority that we have in the charter, I've listed here the policy criteria that our Board of Finance uses. So our Board of Finance is basically the advisor to the mayor on complicated financial instruments like this, and there's a series of rules that they have issued about when and why we would use a TIF project. I wanted to note one in particular, the fourth bullet there. The project must not be financially feasible but for the use of the TIF instrument. So we are currently using, when we have projects that come to the Board of Finance, we have a external advisor that runs a pretty detailed financial analysis to see if the project could stand on its own without any city assistance. And it's only if it fails that but-for test that we would consider a TIF for a development project. You can see there's a couple other things in there that are pretty obvious. I think first, it obviously has to be legal and consistent, has to have, you know, some private sector, significant private sector developer contribution, has to advance the city's goals, has to meet, you know, general risk requirements. So all of that is laid out in a Board of Finance policy that is available on the Board of Finance's website if you're interested in reading in more detail on that. So in addition to the legal framework, on the next slide, our financial advisor, this is a new practice this year because there's been a lot of questions around TIFs. We are producing an annual report that just provides a status update on each of the development districts that we have. And so there are a total of 10 TIF districts that you can see listed there. The first one was back in 2003 for Belvedere Square, and then Port Covington is the one that's most current. All of the projects still have some outstanding debt, although the longer you go back, the less there is to pay off. And so for those 10 districts, you can see there from beginning to end how much total debt was issued and how much debt is still outstanding on those projects. And again, that's all in this report that's also on our Board of Finance website. It's MuniCap report, basically a status update on all of the TIFs. So that's the first piece of information, just what has been issued, what's outstanding. On the next slide, you can see the incremental change in the tax assessments for each of the districts. And you'll notice that, you know, the way a TIF works is that when you issue the debt, any new tax revenue that's generated from that district first goes to pay off the bonds, and any remaining proceeds then come back to the general fund. So, you know, when we do a TIF project, there's a general understanding that there's going to be a significant increase, or should be an increase in taxable assessment in the district, so that we first have enough money to pay off the bonds, of course, and that so second, hopefully, if the project really does well, that there would be incremental revenue that does eventually come back to the general fund. And you can see just on assessed values, you can see the dramatic difference in assessed values from these projects. So collectively, the TIF districts we have started with an assessed value of only a little over $150 million. That's not tax revenue, that's just assessed value of the properties. And now those districts collectively have a assessed value of over $1.6 billion. So there's a $1.5 billion increment difference between where those districts started and what they had and what they've have after the development projects, which I think is a really strong indicator that some of these projects have built a lot and have added a lot to the city. Now, of course, some of that value, taxable value, first has to go to pay off the bonds, and that's on the next slide. We wanted to show how that works. So what MuniCap had put together for us, and this is all fiscal 23 data, is basically for each of those districts, how much revenue are we generating from the new assessment? Are there any other revenues that we're pledging in that district? And then you can see in the gray column, that's the total amount available. And then the second column from the right is the debt service cost. That's just the debt service cost for 23 of what we owe, again, on the original issuance. And in some cases, there were multiple bond issuances. Some of the projects had one series and others had multiple. So you can see that for some of the projects, the net tax revenue is actually already positive. So even though we still have outstanding debt on some of these projects, some of the projects are delivering enough incremental tax revenue that it's enough to pay off the bonds and to deliver excess to the general fund. So collectively, what the report shows is that today we're generating $2.4 million worth of general fund revenue for the city's budget that wouldn't have been there without the use of this tool and these projects. I wanted to note one important thing to talk about is the special tax, which is the second column. So when a TIF bond is issued, you know, the expectation again is that the revenues generate enough to pay off the bonds, but there is a provision by which if that tax revenue is not enough to pay off the bonds, we have the authority to tax the property owners in that district to issue a special tax to make up the difference. And so you can see that in 4 of the cases for Belvedere Square, Mondawmin, Harbor Point, and Poppleton, we are using that special taxing authority. Usually, though, that's billed to the developer because the developer often owns a lot of the property in the taxing district. So the structure of these projects is a way to ensure that the city doesn't encounter any loss on the project, that if there is something that doesn't go as planned, and it happens all the time, there are things that don't do as well as expected, or there's, change in economic conditions, there is a provision why we're holding the property owners in that district accountable so that there's no loss to the general fund. And, going back to that but-for test, since we only advance these projects if we feel confident that they wouldn't have gone forward without some kind of assistance from the city, we think this is kind of the true impact that we're seeing now of the net impact of the general fund, and that we probably wouldn't have had these districts or this development if we wouldn't have offered this type of assistance. One thing to note before jumping off this slide is that as the debt service falls off for these projects, then the net amount coming back to the general fund will increase. So for example, Belvedere Square is the one that's closest to being complete. If we have about $300,000 of debt service today, when that bond matures, we won't owe that debt service. We would not need to issue the special tax presumably, and that revenue that's been generated by those properties would come back to the general fund. So as these fall off and mature, we expect that there will be more net tax revenue that comes to the general fund. So that's the status as of the end of fiscal 23 is what that report is based off of. Next instrument is what we call payment in lieu of taxes, or what we colloquially refer to as pilots. So I wanted to explain first how these work, why we've used them, where we've used them, and what the current status of these projects is. So generally there are three categories, two that I'll talk about here and one I'll come back to at the end. One is economic development pilots. Any payment in lieu of tax agreement first has to be authorized, allowable under state law. So there are provisions in the state law under the property tax article that give you the permission, that give local jurisdictions the permission to use pilots. So these are not uncommon around the state of Maryland. On the economic pilots in particular, there is a requirement to do some kind of economic analysis to make sure that the project, if you're going to provide a break for a property owner for economic development purposes, that it does an analysis and shows that it's going to deliver some kind of benefit to the city. And usually that's in terms of jobs or wages, for example, or it could be other tax revenues that are produced by a property outside of property taxes. There are only 12 economic development pilots left, and many of those are set to drop off over the next couple of years. I'll show a list of those on the next slide. The second category of pilots are what we would call affordable housing pilots. These are also permitted under state law. There's a provision that says if you are a nonprofit or a housing authority that you can negotiate a payment in lieu of taxes with the local government for affordable housing development. And we use these pretty liberally, I would say, because there's a clear need for affordable housing. Because the property owners and the developers on these properties are generating less income because these are affordable housing developments, so there's not as much income to the property owner. We see pretty commonly that these require some sort of subsidy, and sometimes it's not just the city subsidy. There are federal and state tax credits that are available for these projects too. So the process for these is that many of them are analyzed by the Department of Housing. Housing brings those to what they call a pilot committee. It actually includes representatives from the mayor's office, the comptroller's office, and the council. And we go through and we look at the numbers and we figure out what is the amount that we can offer as a break. And again, we only offer the minimum amount needed to make the project feasible. So Housing Department does a really nice analysis, kind of sums up all of the other sources and says this is the difference to make this project feasible. We'll do, again, there's 75 active pilots. We probably do a handful every fiscal year, so some of these do come through the Board of Estimates. You might have seen, there's ones that have come through even in the last couple of months, and many of them don't have a fixed end date because the agreement is that as long as the property is used for affordable housing for qualifying tenants, that pilot agreement would continue. Now, the owner of the property will have to submit some information on an annual basis just so we know what's the composition of the tenants, how many of the units are filled, et cetera. But most of the agreements are indefinite. Very few of them have an end date because of the purpose. And so on the next slide, first I want to just show you the the economic development pilot. So there's only 12 of these left. You can see the list of them on the screen there. We've showed you in our bill report in the presentation when the pilot term started, when it ended, what the term of the agreement was, and what the structure is. The structure varies a little bit. We have some that step up over the course of many years. We have some that are like a flat amount for the full term as a percentage of taxes. We actually have one very old one that's only $1 on an annual basis. Two of them actually that are only $1 on an annual basis. So, you know, the advantage of pilots is that you do have the opportunity to kind of negotiate on a case-by-case basis. But because we have a pretty aggressive offering of tax credits, we've generally moved away from pilots. You can see the last one that was authorized was all the way back in 2014. Just of note, a couple of these on pilots will actually expire at the end of this fiscal year. So Spinnaker Bay and the Legg Mason office building will drop off of the pilot list and will go back to fully taxable starting in fiscal '25. So there is some significant revenue that's due to come back to the general fund once these properties get back on the full tax rolls. And on the next slide, I'm showing you for each of those pilots what the fully taxable amount those entities would be paying if not for the pilot, and then the second column is the pilot payment. So, you know, that final column is the amount that they're paying below the full tax rate. And you can see for like the Legg Mason office, for example, that one falls off, they're only paying 5% of full taxes. And so when that one drops off, they'll go from paying about $200,000 a year to nearly $4 million per year based on their current assessed value. So there will be some significant revenue coming back to the city, you know, assuming these properties, you know, stay in the city and continue to locate there and pay. You know, I think of these again, since when we negotiated these, we did some kind of, I was not involved in negotiating these. Some of these, you know, predate my employment with the city, but the understanding is that when we negotiated these, we tried to get the best deal possible for the city. So in one case, you can look at these and say, oh, wow, we're losing out on $10 million of tax revenue. But, you know, you have to also think like some of these projects might not have been developed if we didn't offer some kind of incentive. And again, the city, you know, does the best it can to make sure that we're getting the absolute most we can from these deals, that we're not just giving away, you know, tax revenue. So those are the economic development pilots. The last category I wanted to mention is the nonprofit pilot. This one's a little bit different. This one is the one where we're asking for voluntary contributions from entities that are not taxable by law. Basically, nonprofit organizations don't pay property tax. So, you know, there's been separate hearings just about this agreement in and of itself, but I wanted to put it up here just because it is a form of a payment in lieu of taxes. And because those institutions are exempt from state law, we have negotiated with the 15 largest private entities that are, you know, hospitals or colleges or universities. I've listed them there. And those institutions collectively contribute exactly $6 million on an annual basis. That agreement we have with those institutions will expire at the end of fiscal '26, which will give us an opportunity to you know, go back to them and again ask for additional voluntary payments or come up with another solution for those institutions. Those, I didn't list this here, but if all of those institutions were fully taxable, it would generate over $100 million of tax revenue for the city. I don't think it's realistic that we would get that much, but I do think we can do better than what we're getting today because, again, many of these institutions use, you know, city services and don't pay, I think, the full share of, in some cases, what they should for their use of city services, especially public safety services in particular. So that's pilots and our use of pilots. And then finally, just a little bit on tax credits and where we are with this. So the city offers what I would consider 7 large what I would call development type tax credits, where we're trying to protect certain classes of property owners or incent development in our communities. I've listed those programs on the right-hand side. I'll go through them really quickly just as a quick synopsis. The first one is the homestead tax credit. That caps the tax amount that a residential owner-occupied property pays on an annual basis to 4%. So your net tax bill can't go up by more than 4% if you are a in a residential owner-occupied property. By owner-occupied, it means you own it and you live there, and you've submitted a application to the state that attests to the fact that you are the homeowner and that you use that as your primary residence. The cost of that program, we're missing out on $20.6 million of tax revenue per year because of that program. The second one is the Targeted Homeowners Tax Credit, what we call the THTC. We've referred to this as the 20 cents by 2020 program. This is the one where we're trying to reduce the tax rate on owner-occupied properties by the equivalent of 20 cents. So this tax credit, again, property owners that are owner-occupied properties get this break every year on their tax bill. It's the equivalent of 20 cents on the rate of 2.248. So it effectively reduces the rate closer to $2 per hundred of assessed value. And the cost of this program is $25.2 million on an annual basis. These are all fiscal 23, the latest year actuals. The newly constructed tax credit, this is a 5-year tax credit on exactly how it's described on brand new construction. This one is actually called the high performance newly constructed tax credit now, I should say. And the credit is 50% in the first year, and it declines by 10% to 10% in the 5th year, and then it drops off completely. The cost of that credit is just under $1 million per year. The fourth one is the CHAP tax credit, the historic restoration credit. This is a 10-year tax credit. It is tiered so that projects above a certain threshold the credit is 80%, and then it declines in year 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. For projects that are under the threshold, it's actually 100% for all 10 years. So we get no net tax revenue on those projects for 10 years. And the cost of that credit is $12 million. The fifth one, the high performance market rate tax credit, this is for the value on the construction of what we call high performance market rate rental units. This is basically market rate apartment buildings, family buildings. The credit is 80% in the first 5 years and then declines by 10% over the course of the last 5 years, down to 30 in the last year, and then drops off completely. Cost of that one is $16.9 million. The brownfields is a 5-year credit on eligible brownfield sites that require some kind of cleanup. There are provisions whereby this credit gets extended to 10 years and has a 70% becomes a 70% credit rather than 50 if they're in an enterprise zone. And what we found actually is that almost the vast majority of brownfield credits are 70% credits over 10 years because they are located in enterprise zones. The cost of that credit is $18.4 million per year. And then finally, the enterprise zone, or what we call the EZ tax credit, a 10-year tax credit in designated districts that are drawn. We have input, the city has input into how we draw those maps. This is for commercial development only. And again, that credit is also 80% for 5 years and declines by 10% thereafter to reach 30% in the final year. There is a very narrowly defined focus area within the enterprise zones. Those projects get an 80% credit for the full 10 years. And the cost of that program is $14.9 million. I should mention there that the cost is actually about double that, but we get reimbursed half of the cost from the state of Maryland. So that's one of the benefits of the enterprise zone, that we get reimbursed for half of the cost. The brownfields, on the contrary, we have to make a contribution when we issue a brownfield tax credit into a state development fund that we can draw on, but we have to apply to draw on those funds. So anyway, that's the sum of the credits. I'll mention here, the difference that I see between TIFs and pilots and tax credits is that tax credits are considered by right. Since they're legislative, you just have to be eligible to get them. That's good and bad, I think. It's good in that it provides some consistency. People know what the rules are. They know how to apply. They know they're going to be, get a credit if they're eligible, provide some certainty to developers of what they can expect when they're working on a project. The downside of that is that it doesn't guarantee that only the minimum subsidy is provided for the project. So there's these tax credits are at risk of, we could be inefficient or we could be over-subsidizing projects. There's, again, we don't have any desire to go in and do a but-for test on hundreds and hundreds of applications every year. We just don't have the staff to do that. But they are prone to some inefficiency, which is why we really focused on that in our last round of analysis. On the next slide, we'll show you again, finally, just that we did, BBMR with Ernst & Young did a pretty extensive report on our tax credit programs. The scope of the report was the 7 tax credits that we just talked about. That report was published back in 2022. I know many folks have either read it or scanned through that. It's available on our website. You know, we did find some flaws, I would say, in 2 areas. One, just kind of across the board. There are some equity issues that come out of the analysis. We mentioned before, again, some of the benefit goes to the developer, not necessarily to the homeowner. The buy right design, like I mentioned, again, leaves us open to we might be over-subsidizing in some cases. And the terms and the sunset dates are kind of all over the place, so we've had to figure out better ways to evaluate the effectiveness of those programs. We also, 2 of the programs in particular kind of bugged me when I saw the results when I went through and looked at the data. The brownfield tax credit, because most of the projects are in enterprise zones, we're given a 70% break for 10 years, and we also are required to make a 30% contribution into the state fund. Again, those funds can be drawn on to help with cleanup costs, but that means we get no net return, no return on investment for at least 5 years and sometimes longer on those projects. Are some of those projects good projects? Yes, but I don't like the idea of not getting any return. I mean, looking back to the pilots, we kind of laugh in retrospect at getting only $1. Well, we're getting no return on some of our tax credit programs because of the way they're structured. So the same is true of the CHAP tax credit, that for projects under the $5 million threshold, it's a 100% 10-year tax credit, which means the improved value of the property from those projects, we get no net tax return for 10 years. Now, do we get value after the tax credit expires? Yes, it comes back onto the tax rolls. But again, the question is, could those projects live with a more modest subsidy to incent the development? And that's a question that we've been asking ourselves internally that we really want to dive into and figure out so that we make best use of these instruments. One final point that came up in a prior hearing was we've talked a lot about this tax credit work group. We're ready to kick that off. That group will be convened shortly. We're sending invitations out basically this week or early next. We expect the first meeting to be in February, so we're ready to get that work going. The reason we're convening the work group is that when we did this report and saw the results, we shared that with the administration and went through the results. And there were some things that really jumped out of ways we can make improvements. But they were very adamant that they wanted to have stakeholder input into that, which I think is totally reasonable. So we are trying to convene, we will be convening some folks from the community, some from the development community, from different parts of the development community to get together with us, with city stakeholders and development stakeholders, to look at this, look at the results of the report, and to figure out, can we design a package of tax credits that's similar in size to what we have today, but does a better job of incenting the development that we want to see. So that will be kicked off very shortly. And again, invites are being prepared this week and will go out shortly. So that is the summary of TIFs, pilots, and tax credits from finance's perspective. I'm happy to pause here and take questions from our team or anybody else on those data points.
So thank you. Just wanted to also note, member of the committee, Councilmember Schleifer has joined us, as well as Councilmember Conway. So thank you for joining us. I know there are some questions for the committee. I'll start with where you just ended off in terms of the work groups. I was curious about that. How long do you envision the time horizon for the work group being?
So what I've told folks is we should expect probably 10 sessions, because you need one session for just introduction to the concept. Again, some of the folks that will be participating, some of them will have experience with some of the credits and maybe not others. Like there might be developers that are doing commercial and they might be very familiar with the enterprise zone, but not as familiar as with the homestead or some of the other credits. So there will be one session. The way we've designed it would be one session just as like an introduction of all the members and kind of laying out the basics of what we found. And then our idea was to do a session for each of the 7 that we talked about, like a full session to really dig into the data. If you noticed in the presentation, or if you've looked at the report, we have heat maps for all of the credits that show where we've granted them. We have little tables that show which neighborhoods are the largest users of the credit. There's commentary about, if we think that's equitable or if we think there's other kind of efficiency issues. So there's a lot of material in the report. The idea would be to have a session on each individual tax credit and talk about, hey, what was the original intent of this? Looking at the data, is it working as planned? And also have some perspective from developers there that use the credit. What does that do to the project financials? How does it make it more feasible? Are there things that they would suggest to kind of make it, tailor it to make it more effective? So the idea would be one intro session, a session to go through each of the tax credits, and then you're going to need some time at the end to deliberate. We had put in our bill report, the goal of the work group would be to basically propose a package of tax credits that drives sustainable growth in general fund revenues, and that also does so in a way that provides only the minimal subsidy that's needed for the development to happen. And again, in a tax credit environment, that's nearly impossible, but we want to get it so that it's as efficient as possible so that we're not, not over-subsidizing if we can avoid it, so that we're only providing the incentive that's needed to make the development happen. We'll tell the work group that we're open to considering new tax credits. If there's an area that we need to provide something that looks completely different from what we have today, I don't assume that we'll have something afterwards that looks like what you see there. Some of these might go away completely or might change dramatically, because again, this system was designed decades ago, and we've just kind of lived with, and things have been layered on, but we have to really take a step back and be like, okay, for the environment we're in now, what type of development should we be incenting? So to answer your question in a short way, I think it'll take at least 8 to 10 sessions to get through it, and then to give the group some time to deliberate and come back to the city and say, here's what we would recommend.
Thank you. And I did also have one TIF-specific question. So in your presentation, you mentioned how the special district tax assessments ensure that no TIF district results in a loss to the general fund, but then not everyone has a special tax. Can you talk about the threshold? How does that kick in? Is it prescriptive, like you believe there's going to be a gap, or how does that come to pass?
Yeah, so and maybe if you go back to that slide just to see how that works. It would be, yeah, that one right there. So we know in any given year, what the debt service schedules are easy to predict. You know what you owe at any given year, so we know that schedule. And then we know what's going to be generated early in the year, like which actual revenue is going to be generated from the properties in that district. And it's only if that first column, if that TIF revenue falls short of the debt service costs, that we would chip in and say, okay, we need to tax with a special tax. So we'll know that around when property tax bills are scheduled to go out, we'll know if we have to use that authority. So it's only used, you can see now, only on 4 projects out of the 10 have a special tax. And the special tax can be an indicator, generally is an indicator that the project is either early on in the development cycle or that the revenues, maybe fell, lower than what was expected. But again, the special tax ensures that we can step in, bill the property owners in the district to make sure there's no loss to the general fund. So it's only used if necessary.
Understand. And at this point, I'll open up to other members of the committee or the president if you have any questions. I see Councilmember Ramos has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick one on that same slide. What were the 4 that were kicking in, the 4 projects that are using the special taxing district?
It's Belvedere Square, Mondawmin, Harbor Point, and Poppleton.
Harbor Point. Okay, I didn't get that one. I thank you for that. My other question was, it sounds to me like the Department of Finance is using the barometer of success of the project, which is whether or not there's tax revenue coming in, sort of now, as opposed to when these roll off. My understanding is, aside from Port Covington, we don't actually have any other data around impact, like jobs created, sales tax, revenue increase, income tax revenue increase, minority business. And I'm wondering, I wasn't on the council when these came up, so I don't know if you can answer this or if we need to get that from elsewhere, but I'm unsure why we're not measuring those things. And some of the Port Covington is in their CBA. They've hired somebody to monitor those things in the comptroller's office. They give us a report but that we're not seeing that for the rest of them. So while the success may be that we're getting some tax revenues now, ultimately, there was a reason to have them in the first place, which was to, provide incentive. And I'm hopeful that it's not just a nice fancy building that we're getting, but that there's other impacts. And I have not been able to find where those are.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think that's a fair point of how do we gather, or should we gather that information? It's something that we are considering. It's a lot to gather that information. It's not a simple task. We would certainly have to have a firm to help us with that because it's complicated analysis. But, the report that MuniCap did this year, we kind of saw as a good first step, because I think there was a lot of, sometimes misunderstanding about how they work, and that the city was on the hook for things that weren't necessarily true. So the report that they produced, I found it very helpful myself, because, I'm somewhat new to some of these projects, and it helped me to kind of see, okay, these things are working as planned and there's protection built in. For the economic impact, I think that's something we will consider if we should gather that information, because, on some of those projects, if the net impact is zero to the general fund revenue, I think it's still better to have the project than not have the project. So, you take something like Belvedere Square. If that project wouldn't have happened without the incentive, we'd rather have a good shopping center like that in that part of the city rather than not. So I don't see it as just a financial return. I see it as, again, if we're using these judiciously, and only if we absolutely need to provide the incentive because the project wouldn't go forward otherwise. I think at least if you're held harmless, the general fund is held harmless, and there's the room for incremental revenues, and you have a project that's delivering some kind of value, and obviously there's an economic value to the ones that we see up there that have been done. Belvedere Square is an obvious one. The Strathdale Manor is a housing development in Northeast, East Baltimore. There's obviously good there, but we have considered maybe taking the next step, going into the future, and say not even just producing the report that we have now, but maybe gathering some of the economic or impact data to see if we can figure out what has been the broader impact. And some of that impact might be in terms of jobs and income tax that we're not counting here. We're just counting incremental tax revenue just from the district.
Right.
But if there's jobs, there could be income, there could be parking, there could be missions, amusement, there could be a whole bunch of other tax revenues. So I think what this is showing to me is that at least at a bare minimum, we're not generating a ton of money out of this net revenue, but we're at least protecting ourselves and doing good economic projects that are generating some kind of return for the city. So the short answer is we will consider that, but we haven't gathered that information currently.
I think it would be important to do so, and I do think mostly because, if the tool is working, then, and people know that it is working, then it could be considered in other parts of the city. But if we don't know that it's working, other than us being able to experience how great Belvedere Square is, which it is, it's not in my district, but it is, and all of the other projects, then, I just think that having that impact data still helps us to make the case either for or that this is falling down, or, and it's also important for the, with the state law, which is the but-for test that has to be done. So I would encourage that if we can do that, that would be great. Obviously, there would be, it's a big deal kind of going back to the beginning of Belvedere Square, which was the first one, and now it's rolling off, getting that for over those years.
Yeah, so Janelle just reminded me that we're trying to gather that information. So our firm, MuniCap, is trying to gather the information. So we might have something within the next couple of months to share. Again, that analysis is complicated. It's kind of more of an art than a science in some cases, but we're trying to gather what we can to see what the impact has been on those.
Yeah, and I very much appreciate that finance and the mayor's office and the administration has put so much time and effort into getting this information for us. It is something that I know that I've asked for a couple times, so I'm really grateful that this has happened. Mr. Chair, I have another question, but I can yield. Mr. Chair, I have a question, but another one.
Go ahead.
Okay. Unrelated to that, I had a question about the pilots. You had mentioned that so let me just say that the pilots for the affordable housing ones I'm all for. I think it's extremely important to do it. They're also connected. A lot of them are connected with HABC, so like as a requirement, so that we're clear what that impact is relative to affordable housing. The economic development ones, I was curious. You had mentioned that the last one that was approved was 2014. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And
2014.
so and you mentioned that we're using other tools besides pilots now, and that I would imagine is the high performance. You think that that's what's been driving, okay.
Yeah, I mean, you'll notice, like, some of the apartment buildings, there's a couple that actually dropped off in the last couple of years, but we were doing some pilots for a number of years that look a lot like what the high performance tax credit is now, where you were giving a bigger break in the earlier years, and then it was kind of phasing out until you got somebody to fully taxable. So prior to the high performance tax credit, we were negotiating some of those on a case-by-case basis with developers. So that's a lot of the ones you see falling off. So I think part of the reason we don't do the pilots anymore is, again, because we have, tax credits that sometimes cover these, provide some incentive to do the work. I wouldn't say that we're like ruling them out completely. There could be situations where something comes up that we want to negotiate something that might be unusual or doesn't fit into one of our, tax credit programs. But just generally, because we have those other programs there, we just haven't had to utilize a pilot for economic development purposes in quite a long time.
Good afternoon, Colin Tarbert with Baltimore Development Corporation. I could just add a little bit to that because when in my previous role in the mayor's office, I worked on the high performance market rate rental tax credit, which is a long one. We call it the apartment tax credit to be short, and compared that to pilot. So one of the things that we found, and Bob sort of has described the two faces of the coin on a tax credit, was that the pilots that we had historically done, which you see here, they averaged somewhere around 18 years and I think close to 80% of abatement, if you add them all up. And so when we were looking at how to recover from 2008, projects were having difficulty getting financing, and so we were having similar work groups that Bob's describing. And so one of the things that came out was the efficiency of a tax credit program where it's very transparent, it's in legislation. If you're a developer, you build X, you get Y, was very appealing to the private sector. And so the basic discussions and what the proposal ended up being was, could we subsidize projects at a less of a credit, which the current high performance market rate is 10 years, 65% averaged over 10 years, versus a kind of unpredictable council approval process that feels to some that, this group got A, but we didn't get B. And so that was how we ended up creating the apartment tax credit, and relying on that versus pilot. Developers want predictability. That's almost as important as the actual financial need. And so we were able to, in my view, kind of save the city money by creating a simpler, transparent process that more developers felt like they could participate in than going kind of this project-by-project pilot, which we ended up providing a more substantial subsidy for, at least in hindsight. So that was partly why we've moved to tax credits. I just think they're more, efficient, effective, and fair to the development community.
So these that were approved, sorry, Mr. Chair, just to follow up, that were approved prior to 2014, you said that they had to be approved by the city council?
Economic development pilots go through the city council.
Okay. So I just wanted to make sure that we were clear
Yeah.
on that.
And the 2014 project was the last one that was approved prior to the high performance market rate tax credit being approved. So we haven't done a pilot for apartment buildings, at least since that credit's been enacted. And it's kind of solved the gap that developers need versus the pilots that we had done in the past.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you.
I also had a pilot-related question too. So you had mentioned before that there were negotiations that happened, and the goal was to get the best deal for the city. Can you talk a little bit about those negotiations? I mean, who typically is in those, and what would that look like?
For the economic development pilots, historically, BDC has been the organizations that has negotiated the pilots and then makes a recommendation to typically the administration, and then those pilots are put into a legislative form that would come before the city council and have to get approved. And then there's a subsequent pilot agreement that kind of spells out the details of that goes to the Board of Estimates. So we typically would review those requests, make a recommendation, and then, it's up to ultimately, in the sense of typically an economic development pilot, it goes through the city council, it's legislative. There may be certain exceptions to that, but that's generally the process.
Okay, sorry. And I know there was also, the last piece I'll say on pilots, and I want to open up to the rest of the committee as well. You also mentioned for the nonprofit pilots, because I think it's important to talk about the distinction between economic development and the nonprofit ones, but that it expires in fiscal '26. And so just thinking about, what we can do better. I think one of the things that comes up, and I know I've had conversations with other members of the committee around this, if we could quantify the cost of the city services that are being used, I think that may provide a little insight into terms of what the cost benefit is there in terms of pilots. Has there ever been a conversation or thought around what that looks like?
Yes, we actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because when we were negotiating the last round, we had basically looked at our budget and tried to figure out what are the direct services that some of the nonprofits use. And, obviously they share in kind of like general city infrastructure and services, but we found, and this is back then, that public safety is a big part of our budget, and public safety was being used by most of those entities. Some of them have like their own garbage collection or trash collection. Some of them now obviously are looking at having their own, public safety forces or having their own personnel. But back then when we were doing it, it was what we found was that roughly half of our services are being used by those big institutions, and again, a lot of that is public safety, and that some of the other stuff that we provide, like trash collection or other things like that, some of them were doing on their own. So based on that analysis, we said, okay, what we thought was a fair ask was to say, if you use half of our services, we're going to bill you at half of the property tax rate. So rather than the full rate, we would bill you at half, or the equivalent of half, and ask for a contribution of that amount. That makes logical sense. The problem is they're not required to pay anything by law, right? So this is all a negotiation. I think one potential outcome going into the next round of negotiations, we might need to partner with the state to help us in this. One thing you could do is you could ask the state for kind of a partial tax rate for certain entities, or something that makes sure that it's required, because if not, it's just us asking for something that we can't get. And I probably, in my time in the finance department, I probably get asked more about that $6 million agreement than anything else. But the thing you have to understand is there's really no leverage. If you don't have the threat of a change in state law, you're kind of begging for the best you can get. And so we did the analysis that said we should get more because they're consuming more of our services. But ultimately, you've got to ask and kind of put pressure on folks and ask for them to do the right thing. And we ultimately, that's what we agreed to for each of those institutions. So I think we can be better prepared going into the next round. I think those institutions are working with us in good faith, but I don't think they are paying their full share when you look at our analysis of the city services that they consume.
And thank you for providing clarity around that. Other members of the committee or attendees? Chair McCray, and I'll come back to Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up on your actual first question regarding a timeline for the tax work group. You said that, Director, you said that it would be 8 to 10 sessions. Can you provide the timeline? For example, some work groups may start off meeting bi-weekly and then they move to monthly. I'm just trying, because since your report came out in August of 2022, obviously there is a sense of urgency regarding some of the recommendations or other recommendations actually coming to fruition. Mm-hmm. So what is the actual timeline for these 8 to 10 sessions, and also for you guys to put together some type of report or additional recommendations?
Sure. So I did talk to folks in the mayor's office about timeline. I mean, obviously, we're going to be inviting folks and have to be smart about schedules, but we think it'll be one session per month. If we expect this work to take some time to get it right, but that's our initial inclination is, once a month of maybe like a 2-hour session, for example, because there is a lot of meat in the report to go through. So we'll try to speed it up as much as we can, but that's our kind of initial inclination.
Is it fair to say that we may not have a report until 2025 from this work group?
It's possible. It's possible. We would be aiming for later in 2024, but it is possible. I think, you know, it really depends on how long the deliberations take at the end. Like I said, we want to have one session to really go through each of the credits, how it's being used, who's using it, where, how it's working, how it's not working. And then you're going to need some time at the end to deliberate, for the group to deliberate as a whole and say, okay, here's our recommendation on what we would propose. And so we have kind of mapped out a schedule of each of the topics that we would discuss, like an agenda. But the timeline will depend a little bit on schedules of folks on the work group, but we'd like to do at least once a month, and if we can do even more frequently, if it's possible, we would certainly do that.
Thank you. Other jurisdictions have been creative about nonprofit tax and non-government tax-exempt parcels. Has the administration considered fees for not just, say, the larger nonprofits, but for all nonprofits who are using city services? It could be up to $100 million a year that nonprofits are using these city services and not paying for them. So have we considered like water and stormwater fees? Have we considered like maybe street and sidewalk fees, just throwing out some examples?
Yeah, the one thing that did come up in the last round, not a fee exactly, but there was the idea of having a bed tax. The idea, like, would the local jurisdiction have the right to levy a tax, which some other jurisdictions do, which again, when you're dealing with, like, you know, dormitories or hospitals or things of that sort, is that a possibility? I don't remember if we found that was allowable or legal. Actually, I think at one point the council actually proposed and then pulled back. I mean, again, this goes back at least 8 or 10 years. So we have looked at those things, and we'll look at it again in preparation for, you know, next round to see what our options are. That's the one that jumps out at me that I remember.
That's good to hear. Like many of my colleagues, we're constantly thinking about how are we going to pay for Kirwan. And our nonprofits, a large percentage are utilizing our city services. We need to be very creative about how to make sure that we are recouping some of these dollars. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, thank you, Councilmember McCray, and I think it is important for us to, you know, as you say, Director Seneme, to be prepared in this next round, but also being creative and thinking about what can be effective and happen in other places as well. Councilmember Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just my first question is to follow up on our colleague's question. Did I hear you say, Mr. Seneme, that you think half of the services, the public safety services, are used by these nonprofits that are listed? Did I hear that right? I may have heard it.
That's right. And that was, again, that was years ago, so that has changed a little bit, because I know some of the institutions have either proposed or in the process of trying to have their own, you know, police force. But when I say public safety, it's not just police, but it's also fire services as well. So, yeah, and so what we had found was, and again, I'm very roughly, that it was, at that time, it was pretty easy to say that nonprofits were using most of our public safety services, and if that makes up about half of our general fund budget, we were going into the negotiation saying, hey, you're using about half of ours, so a preliminary ask was take the full tax rate, cut it roughly in half, and say, here's the request of what we're asking you to voluntarily contribute. That will change when we do that analysis, and we'll have to do this again in preparation for when this expires. If we do that again, that might change, depending on how that whole public safety conversation and what institutions are creating their own, or some of them have their own, security and things of that sort. So.
Can we have that as a committee request, just to look at it and see what the analysis was at the time, and maybe want to suggest some things to think about for next time? Would that be all right?
Sure.
No, I think it's a good question. Could you restate it just for the record?
I just want to, Director Seneme has been asking about, or has been letting us know that they did an analysis the last time that they did the pilot negotiation, and I just wanted to have a copy of that.
We can provide that. We have a presentation, I think, that we did that kind of laid out what we asked for. One thing I should mention, one of the things the institutions asked for is some kind of credit from whatever the ask was if they were doing something that aided the community or something that they were doing, you know, to assist the city. And
Of course.
there's a lot of interesting conversations there, whereas like we're looking for cash in some cases, right? It's like nice some of the things that they're doing, and we appreciate some of the things they're doing, but you know, the city just needs, you know, just cash sometimes to pay for basic services. So there was a lot of debate around what should or shouldn't count in that type of negotiation. Like if we set an amount that we agree everybody should pay, should they get credit for certain things that they do? You know, I mean, think of like the support that Hopkins provides around the university and other institutions, things they do. Some of them provide direct services that helps us not have to provide them directly. In some cases, we found that that was true, that they were providing some services. So that was all part of the negotiation, but it started from a fixed, here's what we think you're consuming, and there's where we're going to start, and then we kind of back out from there if you can show that you're doing something that takes some burden off of the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there's going to be a lot of negotiation in this point. I mean, I think we can think about not only the public safety services. I would contend that if Hopkins ends up doing what they're planning on doing, there's still going to be a need for BPD to be working with them, especially since BPD is going to be putting out resources to oversee that whatever is going to happen. So I don't even want to think about whether or not they can say, well, the public safety, we've already got our public safety, we're putting $100 million into it or $10 million into it, so we don't want, I think that's just a moot argument. And then the second thing is, there's so many other types of impacts that our colleges and universities have, good or bad, right? I mean, you mentioned that there are services that we don't provide, that they provide, I got that. But there's also some impacts. I mean, we know data from BNIA shows that, you know, where there are colleges and universities, a lot of times the value of the rents go up significantly because the landlords know that mom and dad is paying for the rent. And so that then messes up the market for everybody else. So what does that mean? It would be great to have $10 million into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund as a result to offset, you know, some of those impacts. So I'm just using that as an example of, you know, some things that we could be thinking about for next time. I did have another question.
Chair Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the great questions in detail in the presentation. One of the thoughts I had was regarding TIFs and, of course, the instances in which folks are going to be rolling off. Of course, Belvedere Square will be the first to do so. I'm really curious if you or BEC or anybody have thought about what economic implications may come into play as that happens. And if there are things that we should be thinking about to make sure that that investment continues to deliver the expected tax returns with additional continued investments around the area.
Yeah, I haven't thought of that, honestly, you know, because we're still a couple years away from that. I don't know if BDC wants to comment, if there's any other investments we should be thinking about in those areas.
No, I mean, the goal is to get those properties to pay tax into the general fund. Was sort of the point of doing it originally. So I don't think we've kind of looked at those projects beyond the TIF. I mean, these are the ones that are built too. Like that's the other piece of this. Like we get plenty of requests for pilots and TIFs that never make it through because we say that they're not suitable for public subsidy. These are the ones that have made it through and they've been built. So like some of it, I think going back a certain amount of time may be academic. I think looking at some of the ones that were more recent would be helpful to have some of that data. And I think as Bob described, some of it's, in art, because we'd have to make estimates on income tax and other things. Some of it is more finite, the real estate tax you have in front of you. But I think you could kind of collect that in an aggregate. If the project's been built, though, that's basically what, like, the estimates are, I think, are going to be pretty good. And you can go visit those. So we haven't looked beyond that. I think what from an economic development standpoint, what I've seen is kind of like the evolution, right? So some of these projects hopefully have served as catalyst for investment around it, which you also don't capture directly, right? And there's a reason sometimes, and not that they're a lost leader per se, but like you're trying to make that stabilize a neighborhood. You're trying to be catalytic in a neighborhood. And so hopefully what we can do is, as this tax revenue goes in the general fund and the TIF, bonds burn off, I mean, we can look at other areas to use TIF, but the project has to work too. I think that's the other piece of this, is say, well, why aren't there TIFs in other areas of the city? And a lot of this is driven by the market. And so, taking that revenue that's coming in and maybe setting it to areas that don't have a market in order to build a catalytic project, where you really can't use TIF a lot of times, or you might have to combine TIF with an actual public subsidy to get to something that you can build. I think that would be the ideal scenario, so that you can kind of incrementally continue to improve our neighborhoods that might be close to these investments but haven't seen the level of investment directly in the project area.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I know it's kind of a maybe not expected question, but for me, with Belvedere Square, essentially the crown jewel of my district, beginning to roll off and lose that tax subsidy, they're going to take on those additional tax burdens, and we want them to be able to continue to pay that. And I'm always trying to think of how we can build off of that strength and ensure that that strength remains there when they continue when they take on that additional tax burden.
I mean, just a point of clarification. Yeah. In the TIF example, they're actually, like, when the TIF bonds are paid off, their tax bill is the same from day one to the end. It really doesn't affect them. They may or may not have a special tax, but the total bond payment, which is generally consistent over the 30 years or whatever term it is, the property's paying that. It's different for a tax credit, and we certainly get lots of calls in year 9 when an enterprise zone tax credit's burning off, or those issues, and that's when a person's bill goes up fairly dramatically, or usually it's a couple years before, and they're trying to sell the property, and they're having trouble because people are looking at the net cash flow, which sometimes can go back to negative without the tax credit. And we do run into those issues oftentimes, which can also prohibit somebody from reinvesting in their property. Like, do you get the tax credit again? And we're having some of those conversations where the property may need to spend a significant amount of capital that could trigger an additional tax credit. But it won't necessarily affect it on the TIF.
I see. So they'll continue to pay out of the sort of property owner's pocket the same amount of taxes. It's just that will...
It just goes to the general fund
It goes to the
instead
general
of to the
fund instead
bondholder.
of investing in further the property, into the bonds. The debt service, excuse me.
It goes to the general fund instead of paying the bond holder.
Got it.
Yeah, so it won't affect their cash flow. It does affect their cash flow on either the pilots or the tax credits, and that can become a challenge for certain properties.
Got it. Thank you.
And thank you for the question. I have another TIF-related question. So you had mentioned before, in terms of the annual reporting, talked about Unicap. Can you talk about that reporting required, or at least the reporting, because from our perspective for the committee, data is really important and how that data is accessed. So, and I know there's some changes over time in terms of reporting and how it's collected. Can you talk about the data in terms of the performance of TIFs and how you're assessing that, and how that information can be accessed by the council and then also by the public?
Yeah, so the way that report came about, it was actually, it was part of the Board of Finance discussions, and I actually think it was Comptroller Henry was one of the ones who had brought some of the asks to the Board of Finance of, can we see something that's more comprehensive? So this was in the past year. We kind of talked as part of the Board of Finance, like, here are the things we'd want to see in the report, and then we had asked Municap, since they're so close to the projects, as our advisor to compile that data. So it was really as simple as that, is that we were kind of thinking together, like, we want to find a way to make this kind of very complicated topic more digestible for people to see. And I think, they've definitely accomplished that in the first wave of this. So that's where it came out of. It was just a request, a requirement for the Board of Finance. The data is available. The full report, I actually have a copy of it here. It's on the Board of Finance website. It's it's actually, I find it kind of interesting. It's interesting to see how many, different bonds we've issued. It's not just one issue, and sometimes it's multiple phases of a project, and some of the different terms and who the property owners are. It lists all of the property owners that are in the district in the appendix, so you can see what the assessments of those properties are individually. So all that information is publicly available, and like Janelle had reminded me, some of the economic impact attempt at getting the economic impact data will be available soon too.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And then from BDC's perspective, can you talk about, some of the changes that have happened over time? I know there was a time where data was being collected in one way, and I think what you're talking about now is an attempt to be more comprehensive. But I know there are challenges with also tracking data. Can you talk a little bit about that?
To the extent I can, I mean, we haven't been asked to provide kind of the after, impact of the TIFs in any specific way for some time now. The last time I remember doing that, there was like a task force, and we tried to gather that information. It gets complicated on which pieces of it you wanna get. Like, some of this stuff is finite, and some of it is not. So, office workers on site, that's oftentimes like the tenant, and sometimes the original developer is not the building owner anymore. And so you start to lose a little bit of that information. I think there's probably a way, though, to like upfront figure out like what you can collect and kind of build that into the agreements, right? We have agreements with all of these developers when they get approved. We have not included this kind of reporting requirement, and I think if we've thought through a way to do it that's not onerous and that could also be continuous when there are, different tenants and there's new owners and stuff, I think we could figure that out, and MuniCap could probably give us some good guidance on that. So our role is really kind of petitioning the TIF and taking it through the process. We have not been asked to do like a look back, and frankly, we wouldn't have the resources to do that, as Bob said. But I think if we partnered with finance, we could figure out a way to get at least like an order of magnitude, or these projects performing as we had intended. I think in most cases you'll find that they've actually overperformed. So I think it would be helpful information to make the case for TIFs in these projects. But it's just something that we haven't had the resources or the time to necessarily do. And like I said, I think that the projects have been built the way that they were proposed to be built for the most part. So I think the estimates are going to be fairly similar, but in a world post-COVID, things have changed. Inflation, I mean, I think there's reasons to look at it. Again, I'm not sure I would go back to Belvedere Square, but maybe you look at the last 5 years of TIFs. I would also say, like, on the evolution of data collection, I know I've gotten some emails, Harbor Point and Port Covington, which are the last 2 TIFs that we've done at BDC, I think Poppleton's in there as well. But there's reporting requirements on MBEWB, there's reporting requirements on local hiring, and there's reporting requirements on affordable housing. And so those 2 projects do have those reports, and each agency, not BDC, are collecting that information. And so those should be available from the administration. And again, I think that kind of gets back to some of the additional benefits that we work into projects that are not just specifically the real estate. And so I think in terms of how we've evolved, that's information that we as a city, as the public, has asked for and wanted. And so we have included those in the most recent TIF projects.
Thank you. And Councilman Ramos, do you still have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And then the list of TIFs that were in the report don't include some of the ones that that were just approved, like PSO, and that has specific reporting requirements in it. But it also doesn't include, like, Charles Village had one, and a few others. Can you talk about the ones that are missing from this list?
Yeah, this came up. We had a question from staff about this. So our understanding that there were TIFs authorized for certain projects that haven't been used. So our understanding is a TIF was authorized for Charles Village. It wasn't used. We ended up funding the infrastructure out of the budget on a pay-go basis because it was pretty minimal. There were TIFs authorized for Westport project and University of Maryland Biopark project that haven't moved forward. So they're authorized, but we haven't issued any debt. So the ones that you're seeing there are just the ones where we've issued debt. The PSO one, I'm pretty close to that one. That one, we're still planning to go and issue debt. We're just not quite ready yet, but that one's obviously an active development. There's a lot of work going on over there. So that one has been authorized, but there's no debt. So the report is just showing for the ones that have been issued what's out there, but those are the other ones I know of that have been authorized and not used. I think we were talking about this before the hearing. I think a couple of those are probably not going to go forward, or they're going to be so different that they might have to come back and
Yeah,
change.
I don't anticipate that we'll be doing the Charles Village one.
Yeah, right. That one's long past, and the same I think is true for the Westport because there's a new owner or there's a change of hands where they're doing something different. So in some cases, we have authorized but just never used them because either the project has changed or the economic conditions have changed, so.
Yeah, in the
those are
case of
ones.
Charles Village, it was the economic conditions, definitely, for sure. That changed that one. Okay. There's also, I had received some additional data in addition to the report that also had, sort of a lot more in-depth. And I'm just kind of wondering if we can have a conversation about EBDI and what's happening there. The assessments haven't gone up that much. The revenues are definitely not meeting the bond, they're not paying off the bond. I think this is going to be a larger conversation for, at some point, but I think that there's some significant, at least I'll just speak for myself, I'm concerned about a lot of things relative to EBDI. But, the fact that it's not performing from a TIF perspective, as we just talked about, is worrisome. Can you talk a little bit about who's paying, my understanding of how this is supposed to work is the bonds are issued, the, property holder is the one paying off the bonds. If they cannot do that, then the special taxing district kicks in. If there's no revenues from the special taxing district, which is the case here, who's paying that?
So, thank you for that question. This is one that we had footnoted because it's a little bit different, but in the summary report, you'll see that there's $3.7 million of TIF revenue. That's just like any other project. That's from the incremental value. There's a category called other revenues, which we confirmed, and it's listed in the report, that's either pilot payments in the taxing district that goes towards the bonds, or in some cases, that's enterprise zone tax credit reimbursements that are going towards it. You are right in that the debt service is higher than even the sum of all those sources, and this one predates a lot of us. We were actually talking about this before hand. The way the bonds were structured, and it's listed in the report, is that the interest only accrues up to the cap of available resources. So the way the Series 2009 bonds were issued, whereas there was an agreement that we would not accrue additional interest if we didn't have if we did not have the available resources based on those three sources I said, a special tax, other revenues, or the base TIF revenues. So that's the one where it's not, it appears like it's not working. The city is still protected, so we're not losing money on it, so to speak, but yeah, the revenues are not enough to pay off the debt service, but we're being held harmless for that. So that's what I know about that project. That's a very complicated one. I have very little involvement in that one, but it's something that we're trying to learn a little bit about and kind of understand where it is.
Sorry, I don't know, I have a follow-up. I don't know how the city could be held harmless if the bondholders aren't getting paid.
So the 2009 bond is actually a private placement bond, and the holder agreed that they would forgive the interest that's on there. So if there's not enough available revenue, TIF revenue to pay it, it's capped at $3 million. They agreed that they would waive those interest payments.
So they're still getting the bond to pay off the bond, but they're eating the interest. They're not asking us to pay the interest.
That's correct. If there's no
What about the
available-
other bonds, the ones that were issued before?
Yeah, so the other bonds, the bondholders are being paid. So the 2017 bonds and the 28, those two series the bondholders are being paid the full debt service. It's only when it comes to 2009 that if there's no TIF revenue available, increment available, that they are forgiving their interest, accrued interest.
So the
on it.
2017 and the 2008 ABCD, however many there are getting paid in full because there's enough TIF revenues from the taxes coming in as well as the special taxing district.
That's correct, and also the contributions that's coming in for those.
Who's paying that?
So we have The graduate, the John Hopkins Graduate School, their rental payments are pledged to the district, and it's another one, but it's two contribution pledges that are coming into the district that's pledged to the bonds as well. So that's
From Johns Hopkins?
One is John Hopkins, and the other one, I'll get you the name of right now. It's escaped me.
So these are being paid by tax revenues coming in, the special taxing district, and some contributions that were negotiated with Hopkins or NEKC,
That's
right?
correct.
Okay. That would be helpful to know which the other one is. And then the 2009, there's not enough to pay that, and so the bondholder has agreed to get paid in terms of the principal, but not the interest.
That's correct.
Okay, so the city is being held harmless as a result, because you were able to put all of those things together.
Yes. So, and just to be clear, on the 2009, they are getting paid the accrued interest plus the principal, but what's ever not available, it's forgiven on that, during that particular year.
And so the payments that go into that are the payments from the properties, the special taxing district, and these other contributions are also going into it? Or these other contributions you just mentioned are not going into 2009?
Yes, they're all part of the revenue for the district.
Okay. Could we get a breakout of how that works in terms of the amount from the taxes, amount from the, actually, I think you have the amount from the taxes and the amount of from the special taxing district in the materials you gave me, so I appreciate that.
Right.
But I didn't see that the contributions were in there.
The contributions is in that, in the column underneath the other revenue, I believe that was on the screen. So the other revenue, that's the contributions.
Okay, okay.
And just for the EBI, they're not paying a special tax because it's enough to pay the two primary bonds, the 2008 and the 2017.
So EBDI, the special taxing district hasn't kicked in, basically?
No.
Gotcha, okay. Interesting. Okay, thanks, I appreciate it.
President Mosby.
Just one quick question. I know we talked a lot about like the debt financing and kind of the structure of it all, but when we talk about the actual program of TIF, after the special district and everything is authorized, they go to the market, they secure the bonds. What's the city's involvement in spending down of the bonds? Do we touch that much? Do we pay attention? Is there any type of audit process or anything involved in that as it relates to spending down the money?
When you say, can you clarify spending down the bonds? Because I know each one of the TIF, they have the maximum amount of bonds that we can issue.
Yeah, so,
project.
I mean, this is for anybody, finance or BDC, but say, for instance, there's a project, it's a $100 million TIF, and they present to the committee that it's going to roads and pavements and lights and whatever else is factored into the tax incremental financing deal that ultimately totaled out to $100 million. Is there any check-in with the city about the spending down of that money? You know, to ultimately maximize the $100 million, or is it kind of, you know, they give us a conceptual plan, we kind of say, okay, we're going to pathway of doing the TIF, and then the city kind of just leaves it completely up to the developer to do what they want to do with the money? How does that work?
No, so there's a budget. And so when when there's expenditures, the capital expenditures against the construction fund, all of that is vetted through our consultants to make sure that it matches what's in the budget and is eligible cost and agrees with the budget. And so at that point, once that is verified, then that's when the developer is reimbursed for those costs.
So say, for instance, like, say, Port Covington, which the master plan has significantly changed from when the conceptual idea was brought to the city council and the bonds were ultimately, well, the TIF was ultimately approved and the bonds were ultimately secured. Now, with the significant change in the development, how is that factored in, the same TIF amount? I guess the argument's going to be they need the same level of infrastructure no matter if the building's 10 stories high or 5 stories high. I guess that's what the argument is, that the infrastructure is the infrastructure, it kind of still remains the same.
That's correct, because the public infrastructure, even though their concept may change of what they're building, they will still need the roads, the green space. That's the part that the city's paying for.
Got you. So so change in plan from like a master plan perspective, there is no like reactionary need from the city to do additional engagement with the bondholder, with the developer.
I was just going to say, at least in my experience, there's kind of two sides to that. One is the city's process. So where they change the master plan, obviously that has to go through the city's approval process as a developer. And then the other piece of that is, and I'll sort of defer to Janelle, those improvements are still all reviewed by the bond consultant, have to be eligible uses, and they're not going to be allowed to spend extra, if there's extra money in the budget, they can't just spend that the way they want to. It is reviewed. And I would also say that in terms of what they build, because it's public infrastructure, the city agencies all actually review that infrastructure, because it typically has to be built to city standards as well. So there's a lot of involvement from the city in terms of the public infrastructure that's proposed, designed, and built. And the developer doesn't have leadway of how they want to spend the maximum amount of TIF. It's pretty finite in the budget, with obviously change orders and little things that might change in the construction field, but that all does get reviewed, and Janelle can more explain that piece.
And that entity, I guess, they check in with the city periodically when they approve. How does that process work?
Yes, so if there is a major change in how the project was conceived in the beginning, that still goes back to the Board of Finance for them to approve the modification to the budget. And at that point, once that's approved, then we can move forward with signing the documents and agreements that we are in agreement to the change in the program, in the project.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other members with questions? And I didn't see anyone signed up to testify or anyone online, but is there anyone else who needed to testify or had additional comments or questions? All right, well, not seeing anyone, I'll just conclude with a couple of points. One, I just thank everyone for being here today. As we said at the outset, this is a very important issue for our city. We're really trying to be data-oriented, but also to ask the right questions so we can be prepared going into the future. I know our constituents have raised questions to us. I know we've raised questions today, and I know that this will not be the last conversation that we have around these issues, particularly as we're moving forward in the next couple of years, but also to quote one of our colleagues today, again, the urgency around some of these projects, whether they be the tax credit working group or other things as well. So just trying to make sure that we're as transparent as possible, but also that we're being good stewards of the city's fiscal resources. So again, we thank you for providing the data, providing the feedback, and then also being here today. So with that, we will stand in recess. Again, enjoy the rest of the day and Happy New Year.